All right, folks, it's time for another card review. I gotta say, I'm a little sleepy for this one. It's early in the morning. I stayed up too late on Twitter, goofing around and checking out card reveals. But we got some cool stuff in this one. Some really neat, super iconic legendaries. Some other nifty cards as well. So let's kick it off here with Varian, King of Stormwind. Beautiful, neutral legendary, 8 mana, 7/7. Battlecry. Draw a rush minion to gain rush, then repeat for taunt and divine shield. So basically here, if you have a rush, taunt, and divine shield minion in your deck, you're going to get a big mean Varian that's going to have all three of those keywords, making him sort of a super Tiamat style minion on board. Just taking a great trade, leaving behind a taunt body. That's nice play for 8 mana in many cases. On top of that, you're also going to draw 3 cards and potentially 3 targeted cards, something you really care about, specific cards to get them out of your deck, or maybe you run a couple for some redundancies here with Varian. But drawing 3 cards, getting a nice tempo play on board, nice reactive play, defensive play on top of that, all of that stuff that feels pretty solid for 8 mana. Sometimes you get a lot of value in 8 mana cards, but not a lot of onboard impact. Sometimes you get a lot of onboard impact, not a lot of value. This card kind of bundles both together, which is nice. And that's one of the only ways you can really get an 8 mana card to see play sometimes. So that's pretty cool. Now, of course, there is a risk here with a card like Varian that you miss the rush minion. You already drew all your rush minions. You miss rush, and Varian doesn't get rush. He only gets divine shield and taunt. Then he's kind of a sad little Tyrion. He's not quite as good. He doesn't give you a weapon or anything, so maybe less impactful. Same thing if you miss the taunt. Maybe you really need taunt for the defensive body. Get Varian too late in the game, he gets weaker and weaker. So this is one of those. It's really, really good. Probably exactly on turn 8 in many cases, and probably loses a little bit of potency throughout the game, maybe even becoming a risk to play. Now, there is the question of what kind of decks would like to run this. It's sort of a perfect mid-rangey card. We don't have a lot of real mid-range decks these days. There are a few N'Zoth decks that kind of play like mid-range decks. Probably a decent control card too as well. Just reload and develop, a nice swing turn with the defensive taunt on board. You could possibly even see this as like the top end of an aggro deck. Sometimes, cards like Alexstrasza get slotted in there. Maybe you put this in instead and it just refills your hand while still developing a high pressure minion. I think that's less likely. Most aggro decks are going to want to land a little lower on the curve or have a finisher like Alexstrasza that just goes face, but still a possibility depending on the meta and the build. But he's kind of a jack of all trades, right? You can almost put him in anything as long as you're meeting these deck building requirements. And frankly, most decks are going to have rush and taunt minions at some level. I mean, certain classes may have trouble with taunt like Rogue, but rush minions is like a given. Taunt's pretty likely. Divine Shield's a little bit more specific, but there is always Talon. Talon's in like every deck these days. And then I'm sure a lot of classes will have access to 1 or 2 more Divine Shield minions that just make sense, or maybe you just toss one in. I'm trying to think if there's a good like neutral Divine Shield off the top of my head beyond Talon that other people would want to run. I should have looked this up before I started the review, but like I said, I'm sleepy. Deal with it. There's like an Oyotron. You probably don't want that one. Dark Moon Dirigible. Nothing really exciting for backup Divine Shield cards, but I think Talon alone might just be reason enough for Varian. So I think all in all, basically, it's sort of a Lich King-ish style card. One of those like neutral legendaries that a lot of different decks can play. It's not necessarily like perfect in any given deck, but it's just kind of, it fits in. I think Tiamat fit that mold pretty well too. That was more in Highlander decks, I guess, but I still think Varian will find a home here and there. He's not going to be the star of the deck. He's not going to be the build around. He's not going to be in every deck like something like Ziliax because he's just a little bit too expensive. Ziliax at 5 was kind of perfect. This is a little bit slower at 8 mana, so not everywhere, but probably somewhere. I think Varian will be good enough to make the cut and will just fit in rather nicely into a deck or two. So moving on here to Lothar, the warrior legendary minion here. Another iconic alliance character. 7 mana, 7/7 here for Lothar. And he reads, at the end of your turn, attack a random enemy minion. If it dies, gain +3/+3. So I think the usual use case for Lothar will be like, your opponent has a 5/5 on board or whatever, and you play Lothar and it trades in, kills the 5/5, and you've got yourself a 10/5 minion remaining. So a little bit of a swing on board with a threat left behind. That said, I don't really think that's that good. Just kind of dumping stats on board. Not great in like the ideal scenario. And then of course there are other scenarios where you're putting us 3 minions on board and your Lothar is going to hit a random one. It might hit the worst one. It might hit a 1/1 and leave a 5/5 up. And then it's like, oh, I spent 7 mana and I didn't really even do that much. That's not a particularly exciting scenario. So that's not great. Also, if your opponent has nothing on board, Lothar is just a vanilla minion, so he's not really good if you're ahead in any scenario, which is important because he's competing against cards like Troublemaker. Troublemaker really serves a pretty similar purpose to Lothar. Yes, it's a mana more, but it's the same kind of thing. A big dude that gives you some reactivity to your opponent's stuff. Like the 3/3s the Troublemaker summons can also trade in, and sometimes they could do so a little bit more cleanly than Lothar, because he's kind of a 1-hit, and you get 2 hits for the Troublemaker tokens, and maybe that lines up better against like 2 3/3s. But more importantly, perhaps, is when you play Troublemaker on an empty board, it's 6 face damage and it's 3 bodies, which is often much more difficult for many people to deal with. Also, Lothar's taking damage, so he's actually a little bit more susceptible to dying to like future rush trades and stuff, whereas Troublemaker stays at 8 health. It's the tokens that are taking the damage when it trades in. So yes, they have slightly distinct mana costs, but they're both those sort of like mid to late game, somewhat reactive cards. But Troublemaker has this totally separate angle that's way better than Lothar. So I don't know in what world you'd ever need to run Lothar when Troublemaker exists. Even after Troublemaker rotates, I still don't think Lothar's good enough. It just doesn't really fulfill the same sort of things that Troublemaker does. It's just like, yeah, I summon a 10/5, cleared a minion, that's fine, right? It's like, okay, but it's just not as impactful as other Hearthstone plays and other big things you can do when you start getting into these higher mana costs. And the lack of consistency here, thanks to the random trade, makes this card a little bit risky. So the snowball potential just doesn't seem like it's going to be there. I think this is probably like an amazing arena card. This, I don't play a lot of arena, but it historically seems like the sort of card that would be nuts in arena. But in standard constructed Hearthstone, I don't think this gets there. All right, next up here is Shiver Their Timbers. And yeah, that poor dude there is me after I go bald and lose 100 pounds and get threatened by a scary orc pirate. But this is a 1-mana warrior spell that reads, deal 2 damage to a minion. If you control a pirate, deal 5 damage instead. So at a base level here, really not too exciting. Warrior already has a card like Sword and Board that deals 2 and gains you some armor. But this is a very specific pirate synergy where if you happen to be controlling a pirate, you're getting a much better removal spell, dealing 5 damage instead of 2, which clearly allows you to clear more significant minions. So basically, I think the idea is you get into the mid game, you have a pirate, you have 1 spare mana to kind of flex into your turn, and this gives you the opportunity to swing against your opponent's mid game minions, thereby protecting your pirates. Now, in theory, that's cool. In practice, I think that's going to be far more awkward and kind of a negative synergy for what pirates are about. Because essentially, warrior pirates and the pirate cards that currently exist, and every pirate card ever really almost, has been mostly about being aggressive and going face and pushing as much pressure as you can. And they've done that through weapons. And you've protected your minions on board often via using your weapons to just clear up anything that might threaten your minions, thereby allowing you to push more minion damage. Or sometimes, of course, just ignoring your opponent's minions altogether and just going face with everything if you think you have the damage or the pressure to get there. And this shifts your focus a little bit towards something totally different than pirates have ever done, which is utilize spells and take more like trades on board or tidy up your opponent's board instead of spending every mana point possible to create as much pressure as you can, thereby putting your opponent on the back foot. So yes, a very efficient card in the very specific scenario of a pirate, But our pirate deck's going to want to run a card like this. Would they rather just run something that squeezes in an extra minion or extra damage and use every mana point to get there as fast as they can? Is this going to slow them down just a little bit too much? Even if it does potentially protect minions, it's still mana you have to spend, and perhaps more importantly, it's a card you had to draw that isn't damaged, that isn't a weapon, that isn't another pirate. So sometimes it's risky to include cards like this in your deck, particularly if your curve is already really low and fast. This is another really low and fast card, so you might run out of gas before you get there for a lethal. So it's just not synergistic with what we normally see for an aggro style deck. Now, that said, there are a few pirates and warriors that are being run outside of aggro shells. We've got the Frenzy Anchorman guy. We've got the 4-mana Sword Eater dude. So, theoretically, if you think you could get enough pirates in more of a mid-range deck or even a control deck, maybe this gives you like a little bit more efficient minion removal. That said, I don't think you want to be sitting on a card like this, hoping that it gets good enough in those scenarios where we have a pirate on board, because you're not always going to have a pirate in hand that's going to be playable. You're not always going to want to spend mana on that pirate to unlock this. You have other removal spells that are just almost as good as this or as efficient as this. Just run a shield slam and have some armor, right? Like, that's probably a condition that's often easier to achieve for a control deck if you're going that route. And yeah, of course, this does have the backup of dealing 2, but that's just not good enough to even really consider. This has to be dealing 5 to be better than other cards that exist, particularly in a control archetype. So basically, where does this card live? Why are you running it? Is the payoff on this enough to make it worth the risk of having such a low impact card and having such a conditional card in your deck? I think the answer is no, it's not worth it. All right, here. So moving on to tiny toys for Shaman. This is such a cool card art here. Basically, little toy maker making some Hearthstone toys. How much I would kill for these Hearthstone toys. Looks like maybe a Malygos, a Barnes, Ragnaros, a Noitron, Cthulhu in the background, more like Tiny Fin, maybe Dr. Boom. Can't quite. Maybe that's a Snow Flipper Penguin up there at the top. So pretty cool. Anyway, the card itself, 6-mana spell for Shaman. Summon 4 random 5-cost minions, then change their stats to 2/2s. So pretty similar to some of the other, tokeny summoning sort of cards in the mid game we've seen across a variety of classes. But in this case, you have the upside here potentially of some pretty crazy card text thanks to 5-mana minions. So instead of just getting, 4 2/2s like you might get with the totem summoning card in Shaman, these are 4 2/2s that have text, and sometimes really crazy good text, right? So think about Burning Blade Acolyte. That's a 2/2 with a death rattle that summons a 5/8. That's insane. Think about Inara. You could get 4 Inaras off of this, and you could suddenly have 8 attack and Wind Fury on your hero and hit the opponent for 16. Somebody's going to do that to me, I know. You could get 4 Grey Bows and create this just insurmountable Grey Bow board where they kill one and all the others start popping off if they can't clear them all simultaneously. And that's just the beginning of the list, right? There's other stuff like Aegwynn and Ras and just some really, really cool card texts. And there are certainly some that are just not going to do much for you or will feel like vanilla 2/2s or maybe just like a 2/2 with Rush or something, which is fine. But, not amazing. So I think at a base level, it's got some cool potential. I don't think that will be good enough necessarily to run in a deck in and of itself because it lacks some consistency. You don't really know which 5-drops you're going to get. You don't know how they're going to interact with your opponent's board. You don't know if they're going to be sticky versus, flash in the pan. So it'd be hard to put this in a deck for that reason alone. But you've also got to play here potentially with things like Revolve or Evolve, where you can turn this into a bigger stat play. So you take the 2/2s and you turn them into 6-drops with some sort of Evolve, or just Revolve currently in Standard turns them into 5-drops again. You get a reroll basically, but you also have awesome stats on top of it. And it becomes this kind of 7-mana summon 4 5-drops board builder potential. You can also do that with Bogspine Knuckles, set up a turn earlier and then follow it up with Tiny Toys on 6. Don't forget Bogspine Knuckles still in standard format. Doesn't feel like it sometimes. So a couple different Evolve lines are possible here with Tiny Toys. I don't know if it's good enough to create an entire Evolve Shaman archetype. There's kind of one lingering around out there. It's the 3rd or 4th best Shaman archetype at the moment. I don't think this necessarily gets it over the hump. I think this is one of those cards that's fine. Doesn't really carve out a deck necessarily, but is pretty crazy sometimes off of like random generation effects. You just discover into this and it becomes a really important sort of card that it exists, but not necessarily a card that's making its way into a ton of deck lists. So next up here, another Shaman card. This is Overdraft. Pretty crazy one. 1 mana spell for Shaman. It's tradable. Reminder, untradeable. We haven't talked about it in a few reviews. That means if you want to, you can trade it back into your deck at a cost of 1 mana, and you'll draw a new card. So you get rid of Overdraft for now at the cost of 1 mana. You cycle into something new. But the effect on this is that you unlock your overloaded mana crystals to deal that much damage. So if you've overloaded 9 mana crystals, you can overdraft to deal 9 damage to the opponent, and that, maybe that's sort of the top end of the range of what you might expect. More realistically, I think this is like a 1 mana deal 4, deal 5 is certainly possible with cards like Lightning Bloom in particular. You could do things like double Lightning Bloom, hit your opponent for 4 right there. Any other cards you want to squeeze in with it. Some pretty crazy burst potential possible. Also keep in mind this is unlocking the overloaded crystals, so you can use cards like Lightning Bloom to cheese into a bunch of extra mana without the punish essentially on a future turn. You don't have to risk the punish. You just unlock and you get to throw some face damage the opponent's way as well, which, we've seen Shaman run a lot of face damage cards lately and succeed with him quite nicely in the current Hearthstone meta. Now, this doesn't perfectly synergize with what Shaman's doing right now because this isn't a nature spell. And Shaman is relying on a little bit of nature spell synergy stuff with their Dungeoneer. So that's a little bit at odds there, but this card might be good enough or might move things more towards an overload synergy line just because this could be worth it, right? This could be absolutely bonkers for how efficient this pumps out damage. And the tradable aspect can't be slept on here either because if you don't have a lot of overload stuff in hand, toss this back in the deck for a while until you find overload stuff. If you don't need damage right now, you're not quite at the end phase of the game where sometimes it feels like damage can get stuck in hand, toss this back in the deck, find something new, wait to use the overdraft later. So this basically becomes a really flexible tool with a ton of damage output. It clears overload crystals as well. So, you're removing a lot of the penalty that normally exists for overload. So kind of 3 different ways to use this card really, really well, I think. And that makes it a scary, high potential card. So moving on here to the Park Panther, a new druid beast. It's a 4 mana 4/4 with Rush. And it reads, whenever this attacks, give your hero +3 attack this turn. So yeah, pretty tempo focused Rush minion here for the mid game. Get to take a nice little trade with it and potentially either go face for 3 or maybe hit another little thing for 3. Swinging a mid-game board pretty nicely. This is quite a bit of output for this card. I compared it to all the other 4 mana rushes that exist in Hearthstone at the moment in Standard, and I think it sort of holds up. It's in a different direction than most. If you think, about like, say, Kargath, right? That's like really high value, sort of delayed payoff, but it's just a 4/4. If you think about like Fishy Flyer, that's another sort of like value driven card. This one's definitely more tempo driven because that attack is, probably going to be something you run into a second minion. Maybe you're just an aggressive deck and you're looking to push some face damage. Now, I don't think this is almost ever going to get to attack a second time where you get to net that +3 attack again. That just seems so unlikely to me because, after this takes a trade, it's usually going to have like 2 health or maybe 1 health even left. And most opponents will be able to clean it up pretty easily. So I don't think you should rely on that. There are some ways to potentially copy this. There's like Menagerie Wardens actually in Standard on curve to follow this up or play it late in the game. There's other stuff that we can do too. I don't think that's really worth it. Just to net like 3 extra attack. It doesn't seem like the payoff there is really worth it. It's, it takes a while to stack up 3 attack to be something that's really threatening or lethal pushing or anything of the sort. So this still just kind of feels like a mid-game minion that's all about just swinging the board. Probably not even going face with it that often, but maybe you have to sometimes. So, it's fine. 2 years ago, I would have thought this card was insane. Nowadays, I think it's just it's okay. So moving on here to Shell Company. And I don't know if the translation on this one's final yet or not. On that note, some of these aren't. And of course, the artwork on these is never quite the high-res version and stuff as we get these reveals live. But this is a new 6-mana tradable druid spell. It summons you 2/7 turtles with taunt. So nice big defensive wall here for 6 mana. Just try to slow down your opponent. And higher cost spells like this for druid, it's 6 mana, but sometimes you're playing it earlier than turn 6. So I would normally say these 2 attack values on these taunts feels a little light by the time you're getting to 6 mana cards, because your opponent's playing stuff that's going to have more than 2 health at that stage of the game very often. And they're just going to kind of take value trades through this or push through them pretty efficiently. And I don't know that you'll have really done much except kind of slow your opponent down as opposed to actually clear anything or make a big dent into their board. And as Druid, you kind of have to swing eventually. You can't just slow them down, or they're going to kind of get there. That makes me nervous. Like I said, maybe you're not playing this quite on turn 6, so maybe the 2 attack is still more relevant. But still, even on like turn 4 or 5, if you really ramp into this, it's still a lot of 3/3s and stuff are going to be hitting the board soon. So it makes me nervous on the stat lines of these. It's a ton of raw stats, to be clear. Like for 6 mana, getting 2 separate bodies, it's a lot of stats, but Hearthstone pushes a lot of stats these days. And particularly with rush minions being so relevant and pervasive in the meta, normally whereas this would slow down an aggro deck, now they're just going to like push through one of these with a rush minion or something, or just a face attack and just keep whacking you with minions very often. So I don't know if this is enough of a wall compared to something like Spreading Plague of old, right? That's a 3 or 4 year old card at this point, and I think it's probably better than Shell Company in a lot of ways. That said, there are things like Solar Eclipse that exist that summons you 4 2/7s with taunts. There are beast synergies, so on and so forth. So it's not impossible for a card like this to make an impact. And then we have the tradable aspect here on Shell Company, which I don't love. I think tradable is best when it imbues a bit of important flexibility to a card. So if it's like a tech card you don't need, you trade it out. If it's something like burst damage, like we just saw with Overdraft, you don't need it now, you trade it out. With this one, I don't know. I mean, yeah, if this is in your opening hand and it's stuck and you think you need something else by the time you get to turn 6, or maybe you're looking desperately for ramp, I guess you can trade this out. All in all, this is another Druid card where I look at it, and it's been the case for most of the Druid reveals so far, or maybe all of them, where I say, it's got nice numbers. The numbers are nice, but something about it just leaves me wanting. It feels like it's going to be awkward. It's not going to fit well, and I don't know who runs it. So yet again, I'm sort of underwhelmed because I don't think numbers alone really do enough for this one. And then finally here, we've got Demonic Assault for Warlock, a new 4-mana fell spell. It deals 3 damage, and it summons 2 1/3 Voidwalkers with Taunt. So, hey, summoning more taunt dudes here, sort of like our previous card. But the thing I like about Demonic Assault that perhaps the previous card's lacking is that deal 3 damage. That's actually really nice, I think, because that can go face. It can hit a minion, so it can be like Flanking Strike that takes trade on board, puts up some speed bumps in the way for your opponent to trade through. Now, much like the 2/7s, these 1/3s aren't really going to do much except slow your opponent down, which is always a problem. They're not really going to take great trades on board or anything, but the 3 damage can kind of help do that for you. So you develop a board. And that means that because this has that face damage flexibility, it's a little bit better in the late game too. Sometimes this is fine on 4, a card like this, but it's not great on 8, like Flanking Strike. By the time you get turn 8, Flanking Strike was like, well, I don't really have much to do with this. But Demonic Assault can now become a game ender. If you're playing a faster deck, this can be either sort of a board swing, board builder in the mid game, or maybe just some face damage late to help you secure the victory, which could be rather nice. Now, that said, I still think this card falls in a bit of an awkward gap yet again, where I don't know if this is enough for Control Warlock. They tend to have cards that are much more healing focused and just more universal in their removal. They don't need things that have like face damage flexibility as much because they're going to grind people out via value or just destroying the resources. And then the other side of things, faster Warlock decks are either usually using things like pain mechanics to cheese things out, or just much, much quicker, more aggressive minion stat lines than these 1/3s provide. So will this be enough of a face damage push efficiency wise for like a Zoo Warlock to get there? I don't know. Maybe they just want more consistent minion pressure than giving up sort of a turn 4 play like this. It's not a Soulfire replacement of old, for instance, where you could really toss in those cheap Soulfires for a ton of burst damage. I don't know if this is that at 4 mana, basically. And it's probably not good enough for Control Warlock either. So it also lacks Shadow spell synergies, which are important for Tamsin. Tamsin could maybe like copy this for extra burst damage or something, but it's a Fel spell, not a Shadow spell, so there's no angle there either. So once again, Demonic Assault, I don't know what it is, like these 4 mana cards and not really fitting into current game plans. But this is another one that seems fine from a numerical standpoint, but weird from a deck fit. I feel like I'm sounding like a broken record there, but do you disagree with the point? Just because it's a point I've made a few times doesn't mean it's wrong inherently. I feel like this is either a lot of setup for stuff that's going to get paid off down the road, or just cards that don't really fit because we have such defined archetypes in Hearthstone right now. That said, once again, the numbers here I think are reasonable. So somewhere down the road, a card like this, it's not impossible that it makes its way into a deck. Varian, King of Stormwind, is a 4-star card. Lothar is a 2-star card. Shiver Their Timbers is a 2-star card. Tiny Toys is a 3-star card. Overdraft is a 5-star card. Park Panther is a 3-star card. Shell Company is a 2-star card. Demonic Assault is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for these reviews. It's pretty cool stuff. I really like Varian, King of Stormwind. This is just like such an iconically clean, like just super awesome neutral legendary sort of card. I'm going to try to put this in every single deck, whether it makes sense or not, just because I like it so much. On the other hand, Lothar, really cool character. I think a card that's going to be pretty disappointing. Some crazy stuff for Shaman. So all in all, what do you guys think? What do you like here? What do you hate? Share those thoughts in the comments below. Go get some sleep if you've been staying up all night for card reveals. Thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.